join hands with Dr. Nilanjana in welcoming you, Professor. We hope that today's session, it will be a great learning. Now, without wasting any time, sir, over to you. Over to you, sir.
Joshua, you can start with your session.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I think it's afternoon in India right now, or almost
Yes,
afternoon. And just wanted to preface by saying that I was an accounting professor for more than 30 years. And after spending so much time in academia, I decided to retire and went to work for an asset manager, QMA. And what I'm going to show you is research that we did as part of my academic responsibilities still, and also what we did at QMA. QMA is a quantitative asset manager, which means that we invest in companies by using mathematical models that are based on economic intuition. So let me start by sharing my screen, and we'll follow the presentations. Just a second. Okay, so this research is done by 3 colleagues, me and the 2 colleagues. Both of them are female, consistent, I guess, with the audience or the main audience of this conference. And one of them is a professor at Bucknell. She used to be an intern at QMA, Kate Zaslava, Dr. Kate Zaslava, and Julia Klebek, who's working at QMA. Now, I want to begin by sharing a summary graph from research that was done in economics. And this research actually looks at the presentations that were done by economic presenters, female and male presenters. Typical presentations are for 90 minutes. And what you can see is that female presentations are more often interrupted, and you can see it by focusing on the red color in the graph. And you can see that for female presenters, there are more interruptions by questions from the audience as compared to male presentations. And that led to questions about whether female presenters are more harshly criticized in the economics profession, but I'm sure that if you look at it in other professions as well, you can find a similar experience, more questioning of female presenters than male presenters. And that led us to the question of what happens with the CFOs. So CFO of companies could also be, of course, males or females. And the question is, are female CFOs different than their male counterparts? And the reason we ask that is because there was a lot of literature that female investors, auditors, portfolio managers, accounting students, CPAs are more conservative than their male counterparts. And the question is, does that carry also to the CFO level? Second question is, does the market perceive these differences and rewards firms with female CFOs? So let's look at the results. What we find is that by using natural language processing to study how CFOs talk, we find that there are gender differences in CFOs on earnings conference calls. And I want to just pause for a second and speak about what are earnings conference calls. So typically in the US, what happens is a company announces what happened to earnings in the prior quarter. So say quarter ended on June 30th. Yesterday, I think it was Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, two very well-known banks, came up and announced what were their earnings for the quarter that ended on June 30th. Immediately after you release the earnings announcement, showing what are the earnings for the prior quarter, typically management meets with analysts in a conference calls, and the conference call happens to have two sections. The first section is you have a presentation by managers. Typically, the CEO, the chairman of the company, would present the main results, strategy of the company, and then the CFO, the chief financial officer, would typically report on the results of the previous quarter. And then there is the unscripted part of the presentation where analysts ask management questions and, of course, management answers. So two main parts, the scripted part and the spontaneous part, where there are questions by analysts and answers. So what do we find? We find that women's presentations are shorter, more conservative, clearer, have less obfuscation, and provide more quantitative disclosures. All of these are characteristics that we typically find in the literature about females as female professionals in the finance area as compared to male counterparts. We find that female CFOs have a tone. Tone is what they project in terms of sentiment, if you want, about the future firm performance. And we find that it is more highly associated, in fact, with future firm performance. So they are able, female CFOs are able to provide the information in such a way that it is more highly correlated with what happens to when male CFOs speak, but they're more conservative in their expansion decisions. So they'll invest less in the company in the next period than their male counterparts. Investors recognize these differences and as a result react more strongly to the women's tone immediately around the earnings conference call. So these are the results. Now let's go ahead and start looking at the specifics of the study. So we typically in academic presentations begin by talking about what happened in the past. And in this case, what I would like to do is summarize the literature around 3 to 4 main areas. The first one is, are there gender differences in economic decision making? And what we find in the literature is that actually there is. Female investors tend to trade less than male investors. There is greater risk aversion by female investors in their retirement account, savings accounts. And my colleague at QMA, who was the chief investment officer of the company, also wrote a paper in which she showed that senior female investment professionals tend to be more conservative. So it carries also to management of investment firms. So women are more conservative in how they make their investment decisions. The second part of the literature is what happens to firm performance. I'm not going to talk about all the details that are mentioned here, but essentially what we find is that it carries over to management as well. Management, when there are more female board members, the firm becomes more conservative in its investment. We find, for example, that banks that had female CEOs were less affected during the global financial crisis, which affected financial institutions typically negatively. And they're also less aggressive. They engage less in earnings management, all the good things that you expect a CFO to have. What about finance or business professionals? There are actually studies that female accountants exhibit more diligence, higher accuracy, and less acceptance of unethical behavior. And interestingly, there was a study that looked at accounting students and found out that female students, accounting students, also had been more conservative and more ethical and more diligent than their male students. So prior studies actually show that females are different than males in their behavior and also performance. Now, we know that women also differ in their presentations, and there are studies that actually looked at it. I'm going to summarize it quickly. They usually speak less. The tone is a little bit more conservative, and they are more clear, and we'll talk about all of these later on. They also tend to provide more support for their assertions by looking at, by providing more numerical information. Now, we know that typically what happens during the call has immediate market reactions and also carried over to performance in the future. So this is the reason that it is important. Now let's look at what we did. So we, as I mentioned, we took the conference call, earnings conference call that were provided to us as transcripts from Capital IQ for the period 2009 to 2019. Now, Capital IQ, what it does is it not only provides the transcript, but actually tells you what which person is speaking during the presentation. So you can actually find out what is who is presenting, and therefore you can also find out whether the presenter is a male or a female. Now, on the graph on the left side, you see the total number of distinct companies in each year, which we had in our samples. So let's say in 2019, we had close to 3,000 companies. And companies with the CFO presentations was almost the same number. So in most cases, as I mentioned, the CFO is also presenting during the conference call. Now, how do I identify the gender of the CFO? So typically, Capital IQ attaches the bio that talks about the person. So in this case, you see Mrs. Temi Romo, and then Miss, she. So it was easy to see that most of the bio talks about this person as a female. And what we do is we extract the gender-related prefixes, Mr., Mrs., Miss, or Ms, or pronouns he, she, his, or her. And if at least 90% of the pronouns and prefixes are related to one gender, then we assume that this is the gender of the executive. It's very difficult to do it in other ways. There are studies that try to do it, but not. But it's less accurate than I think what we did. Now let's look at what do we find out in terms of gender. So it's pretty consistent. You could see that initially we found about 9% or so of female CFOs as compared to male CFOs of 91%, 90%. And nowadays it hovers around 11, 12% females and 89 or 88% male CFOs. So it's still a field that is clearly dominated by male CFOs, and female CFOs are substantially less. I can tell you that we looked also at CEOs, and there the percentage of female CEOs is much smaller. It's more on the scale of 5 to 8%. Okay, let me pause for a second and just make sure that I can be heard properly. Can you confirm that, please,
Yes,
for me?
yes, Professor, you are clearly audible. Yes, you can continue.
Okay, so let me continue. Thank you. Let me continue by then let's look at the conference call transcript. And as I mentioned, there are two parts to it. There is the scripted part, which is the management discussion. And then there is also the question and answer part. And as you can see, during the management discussion, we find out that in 95% to 96% or so of the calls had also a CFO presentation. During the Q&A section, it drops to about 85, 88%, which means that sometimes CFOs would participate in the scripted part, but would not be called upon or would not get a chance to answer questions on the financial performance of the company or the strategy of the company, and that would be done by the CEOs, etc. Okay, so we also try to look at characteristics of CFOs, and one characteristic that was important for us to control for is the tenure. How long has the CFO been with the company? So if we look at the average tenure of female versus males, we see that female CFOs lag male CFOs typically by about 1 year, which means that male CFOs have longer tenure with the company. I don't think it is by design. It's probably an indication that there are more and more females that are able to enter the C-suite recently than anything else. I don't think that male CFOs are more capable to stay on the job longer. It's probably just a matter of history, but we need to control for the tenure of the CFO when we compare the results that we are going to show you later. We also looked to see whether they have education differences. And initially, female CFOs were a little better than male CFOs, not so recently. They have a lower percentage of female CFOs have a graduate degree, but they have a larger percentage of them have CPA license, which means that the more female CFOs came to their position through the accounting side of the business. Okay, what about size? Do we expect to see more CFO females in smaller companies? That was our expectation, but we don't see it with the data. If we look at the data, the percentage of female CFOs is pretty much the same, 11 to or so percent, doesn't matter the firm size. So even larger firms or even smaller firms have the same percentage of female CFOs. What about sectors? If you look at sectors with the percentage of female CFOs, and it's not really different. What I'm looking for is comparing, for example, the percentage to 11%, which is the total number of CFOs that we observe. And there are some sectors in which you find slightly higher representation: consumer discretionary, consumer staples, healthcare, and of course, telecom, and some others where you find fewer female CFOs, like energy and industry. But nothing that shouts at me that what we are going to have are anything like sector bias in our study. Okay, so let's look at how do we measure tone. And what we do is we use NLP rules, natural language processing, to identify the sentence. So the first example here is taken from a conference call in which the company says, talks about a certain plant would leverage existing infrastructure to build capacity and improve costs. So we take the improve cost and our natural language processing rules are sophisticated enough to say that costs is a bad thing. But if you have improvement in costs, which means that you reduce costs, that is a positive event. And what you could see on the right-hand side, we actually show it as a positive tone. Same thing with a company that says we are going to eliminate annualized cost of $115 million. Well, that eliminating cost is a good thing, and therefore it's shown as a positive term. If a company talks about prices that decreased, that's a bad thing. Why do you want to reduce prices? Look at it as negative term. And if it talks about price increases for the firm, which means that they would have more cost in the future, that's again a negative term. Euphemisms. So sometimes management try not to speak directly and talk about try to obfuscate the reality by using slightly different words. The most common example is when politicians in government speak about additional revenues that they need or revenue enhancements. And the only way that government gets additional revenues is actually by raising taxes. So what they say is, in fact, we are going to raise taxes, but that doesn't look good for the people, and they use a euphemism. And the euphemism would be, we are going to have revenue enhancement, or we are going to increase revenues. That sounds less ominous. So companies do the same thing, and sometimes they use euphemism. For example, here they use the headwind euphemism. We expect commodity headwind. They don't say we expect increase in cost. They say something in the environment, like a bad wind against us, is going to happen. And of course, the message is the same, but using euphemism is usually a sign of obfuscation, and we treat it as negative. Same thing about transitional quarter instead of saying bad quarter. Sometimes management speak in cliches, and cliches are again a way of avoiding direct message. So you hear politicians, and unfortunately in academic institutions, deans as well, sometimes they would say something, and then they would say, and quite frankly, or frankly, I think such and such. And I always shudder when I hear that, because, oh, right now you're being frank, but the rest of the time you weren't. So that's a cliche, and we count it as a negative or as obfuscation. Another one is to say in every way, shape, or form. Instead of say everything or everywhere, you try to emphasize things that are not needed. So again, examples of cliches. Okay, what about our studies? So we have a gender indicator, which is 1 if it's a female CFO, and we have it separately for the management of the scripted part of the presentation, the management discussion, and also the Q&A section. Other textual measures that we use is the length of their presentation. So we count the number of words, the tone, as I mentioned, whether they are positive or negative. So the way we do it is we count the number of positive items that we find, minus the negative, that should be a minus, not a plus, and divide by the count of CFO words. FOG is a linguistic measure that asks how complicated are the sentences, and we have this measure that we use in order to understand how clear is the presentation by the CFO. Obfuscation would be the two measures that we spoke about, euphemisms and cliches. And we also count how many numbers are provided by the CFO, and that gives us a ratio of the numbers to number of words, that gives us an idea about how extensive is the disclosure of actual figures, numbers, rather than using words. And we'll compare that between male and females. What are the controls that we have in our study? So we have the textual behavior of other participants, i.e. How many words are being used in the management discussion during the answer, the questions, the tone of the other participants' answers and the questions. We use firm control. So SU is standardized unexpected earnings. That's a measure of the earnings surprise. So remember, the conference call takes place immediately after earnings are announced. And the question is, are announced earnings so much better than expected or worse than expected? And you have to control for that, because what we want to do is find out whether female are more conservative than male in their tone, but it may be that their firms actually had more negative earnings on average than the male CFOs. So you have to control for the profitability, and we do that by looking at this measure of standardized unexpected earnings. Same thing about return on assets. You want to make sure that firms are similar in terms of profitability. Tobin Q is a measure of how the growth opportunities of the firms. And again, you want to standardize it and control for that in our test. And we also use size. It's important, although we saw that female and male CFOs are relatively the same, irrespective of the size. And then we look at firm age, and that is important because of the sort of characteristics that younger firms have less established hierarchical structure, procedures, etc. And maybe females would be better able to thrive in such firms. We look at CFO controls, and we spoke about them, whether they've been longer with the firm, whether they have graduate degrees or CPA certificates. Now we get data for our analysis from CRISP, which is returns data in the US. IBES is analyst forecast. CompuStat, which provides us with the financial information, and Capital IQ, which provided us the transcripts and the bios, so we can identify female and male CFOs. So let's look at what we find. So the first thing that we looked at is the length of the presentation. So here we have the dependent variable, which is the CFO number of words in the scripted part, the management and discussion. And then we also do the same thing with the unscripted part, which is the key questions and answers. And the highlighted items are the indicator variable for whether it's a female or a male CFO. And you could see that the indicator variable is negative, has a negative coefficient, and it is significant for the questions and answers, which means that women CFOs speak less in the questions and answers section. Now I have to explain also what we did. So here in number one, regression number one, we took all the we took the entire sample of firms. So we have about 11%, as we said, females and 89% males. And we looked at all the differences. But it may be a little ambitious. So what we decided to do was also try to look at fairer comparison, where we match each female CFO to a male CFO based on size. So the companies must have been relatively similar in terms of their size, total assets, industry, and from the same quarter, same conference call quarter. So as you can see, this is a much fairer comparison, but the results are similar whether we use the full sample or the more restricted matched sample. So women speak less, women CFOs speak less in the questions and answers section. What about tone? So you could see that when we look at the tone of the presentation, both at the management discussion and the Q&A, we see that female CFOs have a negative coefficient here, which means that they are less positive. Their tone is more negative, and this means that female CFOs are more conservative in how they project about the future of the firm than male CFOs. And remember that we control for the profitability of the company, the growth of the company, size, etc. So in spite of that, in spite of all our controls, female CFOs actually are more conservative, which is consistent with the previous literature. Okay, now let's look at how complex is their delivery. So as I mentioned, FOG is a linguistic measure on how complex are the sentences and the words that you're using in your speech. And again, when we look at CFOs and compare them to male CFOs, we find that female CFOs have negative relationship after we control for everything else, which means that women CFOs tend to use less complex language, or if you want, answer more directly and easier to understand answers than the male CFOs. We then look at obfuscation. So remember, obfuscation was measured by looking at both cliches and also by looking at euphemisms. So you try to soften the blow if you want, or you try to walk around what your main message is. And we find, again, negative relationship, meaning that female CFOs do not obfuscate as much as male CFOs. What about providing more information in terms of, or more substantive information in terms of numbers that are provided as part of the presentation? And you can see that female CFOs have a positive relationship with the percentage of numbers, and that means that they are actually backing their claims, backing their tone, if you want, backing the information that they provide with more numbers, which typically is shown to be much less risky or contribute to lesser perceptions of risk by people who are listening to the conference calls. Okay, now an interesting question is, okay, we established that CFOs who are females are more conservative in their tone. We established that they don't obfuscate as much. We established they provide more numbers and are more direct. Does it translate to actually better predictions of future earnings? So here what we do is we look at the future earnings surprise. So we look at the next quarterly earnings surprise, not the, so the conference call related to prior quarter. So in this case, we gave the example of quarter that ended on June 30th. JP Morgan came up yesterday with the conference call. What we would do is measure the conference call tone of the CFO of Goldman and JP Morgan yesterday, and then we'll correlate it with the earnings surprise in the next quarter. Of course, we don't know it now, but we have a lot of past data, and therefore we can do that. And as you can see, the relationship is positive on average, and the coefficients here are positive, and are actually more positive for female CFOs, which tells you that the tone of the female CFO is more positively associated with future earnings surprises. And that's really nice. So female CFOs not only are able to be more conservative, clearing their presentation, back it up with the numbers, but actually what they deliver is more highly correlated with the future earnings that the company would have. Now, we also went ahead and asked ourselves, okay, if females are more conservative, does it also translate to being more conservative in their actual managerial decisions in the next 4 quarters? So what we looked at was, we looked at the capital expenditures of firms in the next 4 quarters. We looked at inventory growth in the next 4 quarters, and looked at acquisitions in the next 4 quarters. And what we typically find, and you could see it with the negative numbers here, that when you have a female CFOs, the firm engages less in capital expenditures, less in inventory growth, and less in acquisitions. So it is managed more conservatively than when you have male CFOs. And now to the sort of holy grail. And the holy grail is, what is the immediate effect on the stock market, on people who are trading in the stock market immediately around the conference call? And what we find is that when you have a female CFO, there is usually a positive relationship, which means that the markets react more strongly to the female CFO, especially so in the management discussion and analysis. You can see here it's significantly positive, which means that, and we find it also in the Q&A, but very strongly in the management discussion and analysis, which means that investors actually value the presentations of female CFOs, the tone of the presentation, more highly. And remember, we controlled for a lot of other things, like who else spoke on the conference calls, the earnings of the company, profitability, etc. And in spite of all of that, investors react most strongly to the female CFO. So let me try to summarize what we found. So we found the gender differences mostly in the spontaneous section of the call, where female and male CFOs have to answer questions. We find that female CFOs tend to make presentations that are clearer, are concise, are direct, contain a lot of numeric data, which is highly valuable by investors than their male counterparts. And their tone on the conference call is more conservative. And that is consistent with females in general being more conservative than males in terms of investments and economic decision making. We find that the tone of the female CFOs is more strongly correlated with the next quarter's earnings. And we said, this is nice because it tells you that in spite of the fact that they speak less, they're more concise, the clarity and the backup of their information is actually more informative about the future performance of the company. The companies that have female CFOs tend to also be more conservative, not only in how they're presenting the results, or in their tone, but also by investing less in the next 4 quarters than their male counterparts. And what we find, and that, as I said, is the Holy Grail, which was nice, that shareholders understand that. And since they understand it, they react more strongly to the tone of the female CFOs than their male counterparts. So that concludes my scripted part of the presentation. And I would like to open it up for questions or answers, if there are.
Yes. Thank you, Professor, for such an insightful session. There are a few questions. Now, the first question is, they are asking that according to you, what do you think is more important for the participation of a CFO, whether it is her intelligence and intellect, or is it her tone to have a better command on the management?
I think it's the latter.
The tone.
I think that the typical, and again, it probably reflects my personal biases here. I like when people back up their statements by using numbers and etc., and by using facts, not by speaking better, etc. And I think what we show here is that female CFOs are better able to speak directly, concisely, clearly, and more conservatively than male CFOs, i.e. less obfuscation and less ornamental language, etc. And investors actually respond well to that.
Okay, thank you.
Does that answer the question?
Yes, there is one more question. Women management discussion participation is considered at which level, whether it's at the top or the middle or at the lower level? It is more important at which level?
Can you repeat the question? I could hardly...
The question is that participation of women in taking decision is more important at the top level of management or at the middle level of management?
Okay, so what we did in the study, and we have not reported it in the current paper, is we looked at CEO level, females as compared to CEO males.
Okay.
And we didn't find any major differences there.
Okay.
So we decided to only focus on the parts that we found differences or significant differences, which was the CFO level.
Okay.
So now, and this is really a philosophical question, and let me take a second to address it. And it is, what happens here? Are really female CFOs different than male CFOs in terms of characteristics, or is it a self-selection? And let me explain the self-selection. So it could also be that because females are less aggressive, more conservative than males in general, it could be that they choose to follow careers that require less aggressive and more conservative jobs. And it could very well be that what we find is that the fact that female CFOs are more conservative is really a manifestation of the self-selection, and not necessarily that they are different in general in the population or in those levels.
Okay.
And that is a question that we couldn't answer with it.
Okay. So there are just two more questions. One question is, in your study, what was the age group of the CFOs you considered?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it's impolite to ask a woman for her age. That's what I was told. As a result, we didn't have data on that.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And
The short answer is we didn't have data otherwise.
This is the last question. The question is, the tone, in your study, you measured the tone of the CFOs. So was it done only on subjective basis, or there was any scale which you considered for measuring the tone?
Okay, so let me again explain how we do things.
Yes.
And this is actually not only for this study, but what we do is we look at the entire conference call, and each sentence in the conference call is analyzed. And what we do in the analysis is three main things. The first one is we count the number of positive words and the number of negative words. So for example, if a manager says we had a strong quarter, that's a positive word. If a manager says, which they never do, if they say we had a lousy quarter, we count it as negative. Of course, they never say lousy, but instead they may say things like, we had a challenging quarter. So we take the word challenging next to quarter and understand this is a negative word. So that's number one. Then we look at the structure of the sentence and try to understand the relationship. So if, for example, they would talk about increasing costs, or if they say we had a cost of goods sold of such and such in the prior period and such in the current period, if there was an increase in cost or increase in liabilities, we treat it as a negative. And then the third component is to look at events that occur. And we look at events and we have some kind of way to measure what is the polarity of the event. So for example, if they speak about dividend increases, that usually is a good signal in the market. Dividend decreases are a negative signal. So what we do is we look at events and we code them as well. So for each conference call, we have a total tone, and the total tone is the number of positives that we found minus the number of negative divided by total. And we did the same thing during the CFO presentation and looked at the number of positive in the tone of the CFO, number of negative minus the number of negative divided by total.
Okay, okay. So thank you. We have one of our professors who wants to interact with you. He has a question. He is basically from science background. Shaumak sir, can you please unmute yourself?
I think he is not the co-host, Nilanjana ma'am.
No, ma'am, he is the co-host. I did not.
Okay, yes.
Shaumak sir, can you please unmute yourself? I think he is having a bit of network issue. Okay. So no issues. I will be sharing your email ID in the chat box. If anyone has any query related to your paper, they can contact you. Okay. So
yeah, please.
Yes.
And I would welcome all comments on it. And let me also conclude my presentation by thanking you for including me in this conference, and I feel really honored, especially knowing that this is a women college.
Thank you, sir. The honor is all ours to have you amidst us. And I would request Shalini ma'am to extend a vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, sir, for the wonderful session. It was a great, and I saw your research paper and it was a great learning for all of us. So beautifully presented, sir. A lot of takeaways. Thank you so much for the wonderful session. It was a great learning for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
I agree with her. And I will just say that I connected to Professor Livnat through LinkedIn. And though he has experience of more than 30 years from one of the best universities, but I have met one of the most down-to-earth person who is always available there to answer you, to be for you. So thank you, sir. It's an overwhelming for us to have you. And we would love to have you once again anytime near in the future. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.